So we are done with passive transport, diffusion, osmosis, and all that jazz. And we can now move on to active transport. Active transport is basically the transport of molecules or particles, sometimes ions, okay, using carrier proteins or pump proteins against the concentration gradient, which means from a lower concentration to higher concentration. And the thing over here is it requires ATP. Common mistakes that students make in the exam is they say that active transport requires energy. It's not technically wrong, but what I tell my students is, what kind of energy does it require? Nuclear energy, light energy, kinetic energy? So you have to be specific as to what type of energy it requires. And the name of that energy molecule is called ATP. Hence why you have to write that in the exam. Another very important thing to also know about active transport is active transport also uses transport proteins, but they do not use channel proteins. Channel proteins are only used in facilitated diffusion, but carrier proteins, or pump proteins in this case, carry out either facilitated diffusion and some carry out active transport. If the function of the carrier protein is in active transport, we usually use a different word called pump proteins. So students will ask then, which protein do I mention in the exam? Both proteins are possible to mention in the exam, carrier proteins or pump proteins, but never channel proteins. You do not need to memorize any examples of active transport yet because we will be looking at them in future chapters. So an example of it is, I'm just drawing out the cell membrane. You can see the phospholipid bilayer and the purple color structure, which looks like a sphere, is a hydrogen ion pump. And when you use the word hydrogen ion pump, you can assume that it's a pump protein. You know that they are going to be carrying out active transport. And the function of this hydrogen ion pump is to actively transport hydrogen ion or protons. You can use the word hydrogen ion in the exam, or if you're doing chemistry, you know that a single hydrogen ion is just a proton. So both terms are interchangeable. Now, let's say in my circumstances here, in my second diagram in the middle, you can see that in area A and area B, there is an equal concentration of hydrogen ion represented in the red dots. But for example, I want area A to have a higher hydrogen ion concentration. Do not worry about the reason why, just understand that in some circumstances, the cell will want one particular area to have a higher hydrogen ion concentration. So in this case, you cannot rely on diffusion. So what happens then is the mitochondrion within the cell will generate something called ATP, and the ATP will power the hydrogen ion pump, which will actively transport out the hydrogen ions from B to A against the concentration gradient. From a lower concentration, first it was equal, but then as more hydrogen ion goes through, it will move from a lower to higher concentration, or against the concentration gradient. That's all we have to know about active transport for now. It is just important that you know that active transport is the transport of particles against the concentration gradient using carrier or pump proteins, and it requires ATP. Actual examples of active transport will be mentioned in future chapters.